Journalists in Lebanon and all over the world have been facing severe challenges in the last couple of years, from COVID-19 to the rise in extremism, instabilities, wars, conflict. And today we are privileged to be having four sheroes, four people who face these challenges, each in her own domain of work. I welcome today Larissa Aoun, Bureau Manager, News Producer and Reporter at Skynewsarabia. Hi, Larissa. Stefania, Battistini, Reporter and Raid Journalist. Zeina, Khodr, Reporter at Al-Jazeera. And Safwan, Journalist, Activist, Trainer on Media Development and Safety. Welcome in studio and virtually today. It's the hybrid system that we've gotten used to in the last 2 years. Larissa, I'm going to start with you asking the first question. As a field reporter, what was the most challenging topic to cover in the last 2 years? If you want to choose the most challenging to you in your domain of work.
Definitely it would be the port explosion on August 4th. This explosion has marked us all as journalists, as citizens, everyone who was in Lebanon, not only in Beirut and close to that area, was affected in a way and another by this explosion. Definitely how we were affected is nothing to compare with the suffering of the families of the victims and those who were directly affected. But I would say, because I was very close to the port, our office was, well, there was total destruction in our office. The instinct of a journalist just kicked in, and in less than 5 minutes we were at the port, and basically we were the first arrivals, and to see all the damage and all the bodies on the floor, and then to go around the city. And I would say this was the most challenging coverage in my whole career. I had to hold back tears while I was on air. I was struggling with this conflict. Okay, I need to do my job. I need to do the coverage, but some people may be stuck in houses and they need my help. I was on air for like 8-9 hours continuously on air. I couldn't even leave the air to go help other people who I knew they needed help. So it was really a big challenge. It left a lot of, it was an emotional burden. It was a shock that I think I will live with for a long, long time, even though I was born during the war and I lived my childhood during the war. So it brought back so many bad memories, and really I was terrorized during that coverage. And until now, every time I remember, I have tears in my eyes. I feel, you know, it left a lot of it was really the most challenging event to cover. And it really affected not only me, fellow journalists and all others living in Beirut, close to explosion site or elsewhere.
Yeah, such crime affected humanity, all of humanity. Zeina was with her 3-year-old son, very close to the site of the port. I was reading in one of the podcasts about, or one of the interviews, how you dropped off your son at your mom and you left right away to start reporting.
Yeah.
Today I want to talk, I want to know what goes in a journalist's mindset. Now, not only a journalist, a mother, a daughter, you know, a friend, but then you have to go on site and report.
Well, look, I've been doing this for quite some time now. I've covered conflicts in many troubled regions, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So I'm used to the sound of an explosion, but this was really the first time I was with my family, with a child and my mother. we were not very far from the house, and we felt the pressure wave. And Teo, he was 3 years old. How much did he weigh? He was thrown to the ground. I can still hear him say, scream. He was scared. He was terrified. I was terrified because I just did not know what it was. I mean, everyone will tell you that day we thought it happened close to us. Nobody knew what it was, and I think that was like, what was it, an airstrike? Was it a suicide bombing? Because you have to think what you're going to do next. My instinct was, after I saw that, Teo was crying, yes, but he was fine, and my mom was fine. I took a picture, and I tweeted it. I called my husband, who was in Doha, and I said, look, we're fine, but you know what happens now. He said, I understand. He knows I'm not going to pick up the phone and answer him because I have work to do. I said, I just told him I'm taking my mom and Teo back home, and if I don't answer, don't worry. Yes, I understand. Close the phone. I called the news desk. They're saying it's big because they got an AP live feed. I said, yes, it's very big. And then it's a close friend of mine, and I think hearing his voice on the other line, I worked with him in Syria and in Iraq. He was always this comforting voice, and he was the one who really guided me. He was, take them home. I can hear Teo crying. Take them home. Priority, take them home. 700 meters down the road was our house. I left them, and I rushed to the office, then I rushed to the port. Now, of course, like Larissa said, what we went through is nothing compared to those who died in that explosion, and the families of the victims, what they went through, and the others who were at the front line. So many people ask me, how did you do this? It wasn't easy. But I think because we've done this for such a long time, we know that this is our duty. We automatically become journalists. We automatically have to deal with what is in front of us, and we have a job to do and a responsibility to do. And what was also quite difficult is explaining to an international audience, how can something like this happen? When, 2 hours later, you get the head of one of the state agencies saying, oh, ammonium nitrate at the warehouse in the port. You need to put this into context to an international audience. How can this happen? Because of corruption is endemic in state institutions, criminal negligence. This is a man-made disaster. And I kept hearing myself say that for 7 or 8 hours. So you immediately become the journalist, the job that you do. But I will not lie. Up to today, I can still hear that explosion when it's quiet, and my son will not walk down the same street. He tells me, explosion, explosion.
I'm going to go to Larissa because both of you reported, both Larissa and Zeina reported from the site. Larissa, today an investigation is still taking place from what I know. What is the role here of what you guys reported on on August 4th? What is the role of your work right now? And is it actually leading to some impact in an investigation that has so many question marks around it? Amid what Zeina mentioned, the corruption and the facade that is embedded in those criminals that knew or were involved in such an atrocity.
I think our main role now is to make everybody understand that the culture of impunity in Lebanon cannot go on any longer. This was much more than criminal negligence. In my opinion, it's a crime against humanity. And not aliens are behind it. We all know who's behind it. There are people responsible for what happened. We need to stand behind the investigation. We need to make sure that the culture of impunity can no longer continue in this country. We need justice for the victims, for their families, for every Lebanese who was traumatized by this. This is really criminal. And we need to back up the investigations, and we need to make everybody understand that the culture of impunity can no longer continue. We have a job, we have a role to do. It's not easy because we are faced by criminals, by monsters. You know, when the judiciary system is controlled by those politicians who are involved in this. So look at the link, look what you are fighting against. But it's a battle worth fighting. It's the main battle we need to fight these days, no matter what, no matter how difficult, how it may seem impossible. We need to fight this battle.
Thank you, Larissa, and thanks to your work as journalists on site that families of the victims can have some hope that the least strand of justice can be served. I'm going to go back to the first question I had asked Larissa about what was the most challenging event in the last 2 years. And I'm going to talk to you, Stefania, about the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, when you worked for 23 days non-stop from Lombardy, one of the hardest hit regions with COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic. How ready was the media in Italy and worldwide to address such a new pandemic that we were so not ready for?
Yeah, I'm a reporter for RAI, the public Italian TV. Well, you know, during the first wave, northern Italy has been the hit zone in terms of mortality after Wuhan. So the first day of pandemic on 22nd of February, the way of doing journalism has totally changed, and that day we were not aware of it. So we hadn't tools, nor medical tools, neither psychological tools. The health risk and the restriction have changed the way people work and investigate in journalism, surely for journalists who work in the front line, people as you who are every day in the field. It had been a very painful situation because we saw a lot of people suffer and die. We saw ambulances that were unable to take everyone into hospital. We saw doctors obliged to choose who to treat and who not because of lacking of medical equipment, oxygen helmets, and beds in intensive care. You remember, because we lived that in Italy and then all over the world. I personally saw doctors and nurses cry at the end of the workday. So we needed masks and gloves to looking for news and true in place became dangerous inside where the aggressiveness of virus still was, but still is higher, such as hospitals, morgues, cemeteries, and so on. You all have clear in the mind, I think, the great number of military tanks removing coffins because the crematoria were no longer able to keep up with them anymore. It was even tough to tell it. We discovered this image on Twitter the day before, so we tried to find evidences. We called the institutional sources, the army, for example, the mayor, to understand what was going on. These images became the symbol of COVID tragedy in the world. Citizens saw militaries were wearing white uniforms similar to use to protect oneself from a bacteria attack. A little bit shocked, you know. I can't hide from you that someone tried that day to say that it was inappropriate to disclose those images because they would upset children, for example, or triggering panic, a kind of pressure which didn't get obviously any results, but somebody tries, politician tries at the beginning to hide this situation. Another thing that I want to underline about that period, but also about this period, that the risk of pandemic used like an excuse to ban people, journalists, enter into hospital, for example, to verify the news. For example, we had to ask an authorization to enter into a hospital or to have an interview with doctors. And politicians, the region governors, very often said, no, they can't speak, you can enter. So to answer the question, we weren't ready to tell this period, but we should have prepared because, as you know, the OMS since 20 at the beginning of this 20 years ago said we have to prepare pandemic plans, we have to prepare a plan of communication in case of pandemic, and Italy, but also a lot of other countries didn't prepare these plans. So we should have prepared, but we were completely without tools.
Thank you, Stefania. Luna, we've seen Zeina and Larissa on the ground in a Beirut blast, Stefania in a hospital for the pandemic. When we talk about the gender readiness or what the system has available for female journalists versus what the system has available for male journalists to report on such pandemics and crises, what is the balance situation there in terms of resources available to both?
I think that, in a well-established media institution, the resources are there for anyone who's well-equipped to do it. For anyone who is ready physically, for anyone who has the experience and wants to engage in that. Now, having that said, it's definitely different between the international media for me as a local journalist and between what I sometimes witnessed in local or pan-Arab media outlets. And I know, of course, internationally it is not perfect. You have this kind of gender discrimination everywhere. But sometimes, as a woman coming from the Middle East, being Lebanese, being young, a young student, going into that, there are times when I heard comments like, do you really think that you want to cover that story? Not because it hits close to home, for example, because when I wrote about Luqman Slim and his assassination, he was not the first mentor or friend that I report on who was assassinated. I reported on Syrian friends who were assassinated before. But it seems to be different when you are reporting from the screen. You are writing an op-ed, you are writing a story maybe or a feature, than what it is when you have to be sent on the ground. So the question wasn't whether I am ready emotionally, but it was whether I am equipped physically as a woman. And I remember this question very well one time, to go to the Lebanese-Syrian borders in Arsal and to do that coverage. This was an institution where there was a kind of male dominance, while the same story years on came to reappear on the screen, and I had a female editor as a woman, and she was the first person to actually encourage me to go on that mission without hesitation. So, of course, we have to be ready. We have to be equipped with the right knowledge to do this, because it's a responsibility. You have to make some tough decisions on the ground to protect the crew, to protect yourself. But at the same time, you need an institution to stand behind you, and an institution that emphasizes on this gender balance. And it's definitely still something that the MENA region is working on. But we are somehow getting there with all the initiatives, with all the discussions that are taking place. We are talking about it. And this is what matters, in my opinion.
Thank you. This takes me to Zeina. You've reported from war zones. How do you, as a journalist, I'd like to ask this question in two parts. How do you, as a journalist, operate from a war zone? And then how you, as a female journalist, operate in a war zone in cultures and societies and environments that are, male dominant?
Well, first, if I just may add something.
Yeah, of course.
I don't think there's a difference between female or male. Okay, resources you can give to both. I think it depends on the person. It depends on whether or not you like to or want to report from a front line. I remember back in Libya in 2011 during the uprising. It was me, Alex Crawford from Sky News, and it was Sarah Seidner from CNN. It was 3 female journalists who were in Green Square, which of course was renamed that night to Martyrs Square, when Tripoli fell. It was a women journalist, and we got an award for that. And in the reward, the judges said the female journalists were on the front line, while male journalists were reporting from hotel balconies. It has nothing to do with being a female or a male. It has to do with a person. To say you're not scared, of course I'm scared. Everyone is scared, and if you're not scared, then you don't take calculated risks, and then you can get yourself killed. And I think how you operate in a war zone, it really depends what war zone you are operating in. First of all, you need to define that, because there are different kinds of battles. You have insurgencies, you have full-blown conflicts, you have areas where front lines are blurry. So you can take the wrong turn and you're just in the wrong territory. And then you need to define the danger and the threat, because at times, as of late, journalists have become targets. We are targets just as much as anybody else. And I can say that in Syria. I operated in opposition-controlled territories in the north of the country. I was an enemy of the Syrian regime. So I was a target for them because in their view, I was violating the sovereignty of the country to enter the country illegally. So for them, I could be targeted by anyone on the ground as well. So first of all, you need to know what war zone you are entering. And once you know the dangers and the threats that you are facing, you know how to react. And then you need to have an exit plan. You need to know where the nearest medical point is. So this takes experience. And I used to see, crossing the Turkey-Syria border, young journalists with their backpacks coming in. They don't even speak the language. And I would tell them, where's your translator? Oh, we'll find one. And then 2 or 3 years later, you heard all about the kidnappings. You cannot just enter a war zone, put a backpack on, and walk in. You need to know who the different groups are on the ground.
But this is also like such example of someone with a backpack going to report. Where's the company there?
These are the young freelance journalists who feel they want to make a name for themselves in order to get a job. So, now you can't blame them, right? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, they're putting their lives at risk.
So who should be who should be ensuring their protection and safety?
Well, first and foremost, when you work for an organization that, international organizations, we take safety precautions seriously. We have a backup team. We have a team waiting in a hotel room in Turkey who monitors where we are, who tracks our movement, who knows who we are going to meet. You cannot just walk into a war zone and trust anybody to be your fixer or translator. Mm-hmm. And this happens quite often. And these people need protection. They need to be told, they need to know where they're heading.
I'll actually continue this conversation with Larissa, because this is a great message for young journalists today who are embarking on very dangerous territories. Larissa has also reported from conflict zones. And Larissa, if today, from your experience and the risks you have encountered, what kind of conclusive message do you give to a young journalist going into a conflict zone? But from what Zeina was saying, I don't want to be talking about the journalist who work for a large company I want for a journalist who has the right to report, who has the right to be on the ground. How can they be ready to be in such a risky situation?
Really, I totally agree with what Zeina just mentioned, and really these are like bullet points for anyone who's going into a conflict zone. You really need a plan. It's not about being courageous or being suicidal over there. We are on a mission. We're not going to. We know there's a danger and there's a threat, but you can deal with the environment. You really need to understand the environment. You need to understand your enemies. You need to have a team, a plan. You need to be cautious. You need security gear. You need all the proper equipment. You really need to understand where you're going, what's the conflict, what's the context, what are you putting yourself, what kind of threat you're putting yourself in. As a freelancer, it could be much, much difficult because you need to work on all that planning ahead of time. If you're working for an international organization, there's a special security team backing you up at every moment. You feel the backup, and then you feel more secure. Actually, he's there with the plan. He's there with you have your GPS alert. You have all the medical equipment. You have a proper plan in action. For such crises or conflict zones. So when you're on your own, you really need professional advice before entering that conflict zone, or else you're putting yourself at high risk. Mm-hmm. The plan is to lower the risk. There's always a risk, but it's part of our job as journalists. But when you have a proper plan, the risks are much, much lower.
Larissa, during your travels, and Zeina, you're also invited to answer this question. Sky News, Al-Jazeera, big media organizations that we follow and everything. Are there any kind of tools available from large media institutions to those young freelancers who still, want to go and report? Do you run into them on the ground of conflict, and what kind of interactions happen there?
First of all, I really want to mention this. Every organization needs to do some proper training for the journalists working on the ground, and that's going to be deployed into conflict zone, like the HIFAT training, to know to deal with such situation, first aid training as well. These trainings are crucial for any reporter who's going to be in a conflict zone, covering, in Lebanon, every day you have a different kind of threat. Just covering a protest might turn violent. You need to be trained to deal with these situations. I have been lucky enough to work with an international organization that provided me with all the needed training and equipment, but it's unfortunate for many journalists in Lebanon working for the local TV network that is not available.
Yeah, I think it's also important who do you trust, and who you're working with on the ground. I mean, you can't just pick up anybody at the border. Oh, you speak English? Okay, come with me. I've heard that. I've heard young journalists do that, and this is dangerous. And I think what's also important, these young, if I was to give them advice, you don't need to prove you're brave. You don't need to do that. Sometimes you can get the story. You don't need to be at the front line. You can do the same story a kilometer away. If you're working with TV, your camera can zoom. The same fighters standing there, the same ones here, you can take your soundbite. You don't need to be the brave person to stand on the front line. You just need to take calculated risk, or else you're going to become the story. And what have you proven? Nothing. You can't even report on it. So I think you need to know who you trust, where you're going to stay, where you're going to sleep. What if you can't get out? Where are you going to go? You need a backup plan.
Luna, you've reported as an independent journalist from several places as well. How did you get ready? Or now, for example, there are a few things Larissa mentioned and Zeina mentioned that, I look at from a fresh eye, and I'm like, wow, these little details, including their GPS tracking, is intact. So how do you get ready?
Well, I studied journalism in Lebanon and in the Lebanese university. No one teaches you anything about hostile environments. It seems as if we're all going to just sit behind a screen and report on TV. So my first ever reporting trip was to cover the Tripoli clashes. And I had no idea what I was doing, and my colleague, who was a foreigner, was putting the helmet on my head and was, like, wear this, just don't ask. And I'm like, but it's heavy. And she's like, yeah.
So this is a clear message to educational institutions teaching journalism.
And this is why I became a trainer, and I focused on safety in the trainings that I give with several organizations, and I do it with love and passion, because to me personally, this was not available. What Zeina and Larissa they mentioned are not present in our textbooks and should be present in journalism textbooks in the MENA, but also internationally, because the excitement that we have and that I had as a young journalist almost blinded me several times. So also to mention that we are now in an era of online work and trainings. There are so many resources available online for young journalists. And for us, I still take a lot of trainings online. I still refresh my memory with trainings within these changing environments. I know we are all bored of the online life, but here we are almost hybrid, online, face-to-face, physically present. We need to accommodate ourselves. You have to encourage yourself to take these trainings, even if they are no longer available physically all the time, the way we used to do them, with all of the scenarios and everything exciting. I guess this is it. You keep learning. It's a learning process, and I personally still make mistakes. Even if I'm not right now reporting 100% on the ground, but I still run towards the story. But now I have this, this small instinct that just, it pings me in the back of my head like, hey, take a second, just think it through, let's see how it goes. So I think this is very important for journalists.
Before moving to Stefania, I have a quick question that just came up right now. And this is for Larissa and for Zeina. Mark Zuckerberg just a few weeks ago announced the metaverse and showed us some glasses that we can wear and be right somewhere while sitting from the comfort of our home. This is just a fun question about journalism. Let's say that I tell you, Zeina, here are your glasses, wear them and you don't have to go to northern Syria and risk your life and everything. Would you wear the glasses or would you still go on the ground?
No, I'd go on the ground. Not because I'm brave, not because I don't get scared, I get scared. But look, if I'm going to do this job, I have to do it. I have to do it properly. And I think what gives you the confidence, it's not an easy job to speak to millions of people, and you have the responsibility to tell the story and to tell the story, right. You need to speak to the people on the ground. You need to talk to the human being. You need to understand their suffering. You need to understand why these people are risking their lives for change. Why do they want the rule of law and democracy, for example, in Syria? I was in Dira when the protests started in March 2011. We all know what the Syrian regime is because they were in Lebanon. And the fear barrier was broken, and I wanted to understand what was driving these people to the streets. And they were being shot at. And if you don't go that and see that for yourself, you fail as a journalist. You might as well just read a Reuters copy, an AP copy, an article from here and there, and go on air and say it. People will know you're not speaking from your heart.
Larissa, would you like to add on that, or would you wear the glasses and do your job through Mark Zuckerberg's glasses?
No, I'll never wear those glasses. Thank you, Mark. But, the best stories I've told are those that I really felt. You need to feel the story. You need to be on the ground. You need to talk to people. You need to enter their houses. You need to feel that, I don't know, if it's happiness or misery or sadness or suffering, whatever it is, when you're on the ground, you really feel it. And then you will tell the story in a better way. And believe me, the best stories are those I've covered on the ground. I would never give up on that.
Thank you, Larissa. Stefania, I was reading an interview you did with CPJ, and you drew a big familiarity between lockdowns during the pandemic and you being in Iraq, where you said the feeling of waiting inside the house for a bomb to explode somewhere nearby. So for you, being in a war zone and covering being on a war zone prepared you to cover the pandemic, as you were familiar with or trained on lockdown. How did your experience covering war zones exactly equip you to be covering the pandemic from the first very few days?
I think it has been very important, even just because I learned to keep calm, to reflect and project before acting, just for that. I have experienced the lockdowns and curfew while I was reporting from civil war in Syria when I worked in Kurdish territories in Turkey. As you said, I remember the feeling of waiting inside a house for a bomb to explode somewhere nearby. However, the enemy was very physical. We knew that a bomb would soon hit. On the contrary, here, also now, the virus is invisible and it can hide anywhere. So you do not have a physical connection to it. You only experience its consequences when you see coffins being transported by army trucks, or when you go to hospital and see people dying. The enemy is everywhere, and you don't know how to defend yourself but them. It's a military approach. We understood that if we have masks and gloves, if we clean everything after interviews, we could work and we could cover everything, enter into hospital, talking with people, verify news. I don't think that the real problem now is the tools, but there were fewer journalists at work during the lockdown. It was almost impossible for freelance journalists to get permissions to move around the country. Fewer journalists means fewer watchdogs, that's to say democratic deputies. That was the problem now for journalism in Italy.
Stefania, at the beginning of the pandemic, as a viewer, I remember seeing a lot of publications be sharing images that scared the hell out of us. They were sharing like of the dead bodies being wrapped and etc. And the more time advanced now, the more we understand the virus, and of course the medical field required some time to communicate to you guys as journalists. How well equipped and how well in liaison were you guys with the medical field? Did you have to fact check everything with like a reliable resource, or if you saw something, it was enough to just put it on your Twitter or put it on or pass it to the network? Was there a protocol for that? Was there a process, or was it just let's cover what's going on?
Not at the beginning, not at all, because Italy didn't have any pandemic plans and didn't have any communication plan. So the director said, "Okay, go out and tell what you see." I'm neither a doctor nor a scientist, so it's very difficult to verify what scientists say, what pharmaceutical companies say. Also because the vaccine contracts have not been published, they're blurred in the important parts. I'm a simple reporter in that historical meaning of the present time. I used to say in the field. So actually, I feel like a witness in that moment and now. Probably now we have more tools to understand and to verify, but a lot of news are covered, are hid. So we need a change in the data journalism in Italy, I think.
Thank you, Stefania. Luna, you work with media development and you work in the educational element of media. And there has been criticism, a lot of criticism, about the way that the pandemic was covered in certain areas, the way the pandemic was utilized as well, whether it is to, some people, and I'm talking now what the public would say, not the professionals. Some people, even in Lebanon, I was at some point and they would say, oh, well, now they're going to shut our protests down and just scare us with COVID.
Yeah, with COVID news.
In this young generation, how genuine do you think the coverage of the pandemic has been in Lebanon? And do you believe, from what you've seen and what you've experienced from both ends, do you see that was the pandemic used politically to actually shut down major movements, and who facilitated that?
Okay, well, honestly, my honest opinion is that I don't see any conspiracy theories when it comes to the pandemic. They didn't need to use it to shut down protests. I mean, the world was scared. Lebanese people were scared. Most of us, because of the economical crisis in Lebanon, had moved back to live in family houses with our parents to lower the cost or to limit the costs. So we had to make choices. Going to a protest became more and more risky. I remember that I was covering on the ground when it started, and then I had to make the tough choice because my father, has a respiratory condition, so I cannot put him at that risk. So I moved my work online here, and since we are talking about data journalism and verification, what I was doing was calling the Ministry of Health almost every day to verify the numbers, or just sitting online, not fighting with people, but just correcting their ideas or their links that they are sharing information. I was not doing the journalism.
And they were answering you, the Ministry of Health?
Yes,
you were calling their
I
number?
Was calling them. I was calling the Hariri Hospital in Lebanon, Dr. Firas Abyad, verifying numbers. Someone would say, at the very first few days, people would say like, oh, something happened to someone in Hamra Street all of a sudden. Oh, the physical aspects of this virus are not as they are telling us. And I'm like, no, I had to post things on Twitter, like 1, 2, 3 bullet points about this virus. I had to research the virus. So yes, I was not on the ground covering it, but I did intentionally choose to correct how it was perceived by people, because I felt that it was my responsibility. And I used to go through WhatsApp groups for the family and all of that. Everything that's being forwarded, I used to delete it. Like, no, this is not accurate. Stop forwarding misinformation. So I feel that when the pandemic was starting, the media coverage in Lebanon was okay. It was good. They were stating the facts. But then there was the alternative media, where pages on Instagram, where accounts on Twitter also started to maybe spread more awareness, share with people how dangerous their actions are, why we shouldn't go into elevators without masks, but an elevator has a system, the air chain, all of these details.
But Luna, here also I have to, out of objectivity, I have to say that a lot of these accounts as well, when you have a non-medical account who can just open an Instagram account, go and prescribe ivermectin for you, and then cause a big, spike in the sales of ivermectin in a place or so on. So where is this line drawn between, sure, I want this citizen reporting and I want these accounts, then there are it reminds me of earlier what Zeina and Larissa were talking. They have to be very well prepared by their institutions that watch their safety to go on the ground. Here we're talking about a pandemic that can come and kill you inside your house, and you're telling me that an Instagram account is one of the tools available. What do we do with these accounts?
You communicate with these accounts. You are, as you were saying, Zeina, you are a watchdog as well for these accounts. You communicate with them. You tell them, because they have a bigger reach. Whether we like it or not, social media sometimes overlaps with our work in certain areas. You have to keep a close line of communication. You have to correct them. And I did this many times when there were misinformation, when there were pictures that are not necessary that were being shared. I felt that I can intervene as a journalist and just give them this small nudge. However, this does not in any way replace any medical opinion. This is why constantly we were glued to Twitter, reading what some doctors are saying, what the Ministry of Health is saying, despite our political opinions and our, how we think of the government. At the end of the day, you need an official source. Now, once the official source is mistaken, we hold them accountable. But if I need numbers, if I need to be realistic, I need these resources. So you just keep a line of communication open, and you hope that the people on the other side of these Instagram accounts or social media accounts listen to you, or at least, trust you within this line of work. Yeah.
Thank you, Luna. Larissa, and this is very we are flowing with the discussion. Lebanon has been going through a lot, from the pandemic to the Beirut port blast that we spoke about earlier, to to the revolution, to the economic collapse. What is the thin line here between activism and journalism, or are they actually, or have they become one today in Lebanon? And then I have another question for you, but let's start with.
Well, yeah, there is a thin red line, as they say, because actually you feel involved. You feel you need to support this cause. Honestly, I felt I needed to support the youth, their dreams, their mission, because it was once my dream, but it never came true. So all that movement that started on October 17, I felt as if I'm really involved. I have a role to play, a responsibility. It's the future of my country, the future of my kids. So really, I've waited so long for that moment, and it was really full of hope, full of dreams, and I felt like I really needed to support it. But put that aside, I'm a journalist at the end of the day, and really, there's a difference between activism and journalism, and the policy of your organization, not stepping the line, respecting the ethics of your job, not to react too much, not to take sides, not to be too close to the interviewers or to the public. We have some rules in our job, suddenly, you're so connected to this movement, and at the same time, you're asked to cover objectively, just as you did in other situations. But it was really hard not to interact with them, not to be sometimes a bit on their side, when you're especially when you are interviewing those who are, those you consider corrupt, you consider the cause of the destruction of our country, and you need to be very professional on air, not on air. You're representing an organization, you're a journalist, there's a credibility, but at the same time, it was really hard not to feel responsible and not to feel involved in this particular movement that started on October 17th.
So when we talk about objectivity, one example, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, some Lebanese channels have banned politicians from having a voice in the media, or certain figures. So if we really want a drastic change in the system, and if we really want to move forward, and if we really want to put them down, you just don't give them a voice, shut them down. Where does objectivity play here? Would you support such a measure by an institution to shut down the featuring of a politician because they should just leave? Or would you say objectivity of the press would be compromised with such measure?
I think objectivity is a very large word. It's really difficult to define, especially in Lebanon with all what's going on. It's really difficult to define objectivity. Every television in Lebanon or every media outlet, in a way, is dependent to someone related to a politician, especially when it comes to finances. What you just mentioned, blocking politicians from going on air. Well, I know that's a way of doing things. That's a policy. Every news network has, every media outlet would have its own policy. That's a way of doing things, but basically that's not enough in Lebanon. And we know very well how things goes, especially when most of the networks are linked to a politician or another.
So that is a root problem there. Zeina, again, I go back to the example of you and your child. Put your child, you have to go be on air. How unbiased can you actually be in such a situation? I mean, there is a criminal, or there are criminals that just caused an atrocity. Now it's personal.
But the facts spoke for themselves. The facts spoke for themselves. You're walking, if your camera was filming, people with bloodied faces, homes destroyed, people stuck underneath the rubble, people dead, hospitals overwhelmed, ammonium nitrate, highly flammable material, stored in a warehouse with highly flammable material. I think the facts were there. This was, but just to talk about a little bit more about, let's say, October 17th. Okay, about the hope and the expectation. I think what's important for any journalist is to put things into context. And working for an international channel has taught me a lot, because you're no longer just working, talking to the Lebanese audience. You have to explain to the world. When you see a crowd of people in a square, all holding the Lebanese flag, the optics show something. But in reality, is there a nation? Is there a state? And I think this is where we come in as journalists. We need to make sure, okay, there was so much hope and people had high expectations, but still, the majority was not on the ground. And I think we said that from day one. As much as maybe in your heart you would like to see change, but at the same time you have to remember your job is to report what is happening. And no, people were still supporting the traditional political parties. We see that up to today. Yes, the thugs of the political parties terrorized the people. The state, there was a militarized response from the state. You report that as well. But I think context. If you put things into context and the facts speak for yourself, there's objectivity. Yes, it is a big word, but you also have to give voice to others. I'll give you just one example. The other day, somebody was asking me this question. When we used to report from Afghanistan 2007, 8, 9, Al-Jazeera used to give a voice to the Taliban. okay? And we were accused of being a terrorist network. But if I did not speak to the Taliban back in 2007 and 8 and go to their heartland in the south, listen to what people have to say when they say the West is the enemy of Islam, you will never, from that time, you know that the war will never be won. And that's how you do good reporting. You give voice to everybody, you know, and then you put things into context. As much as people do not want to hear their voice, but you do, in order to understand what is going on and to understand what is to come later on. And we saw what happened today. They took off over the country in what, in a matter of hours? Because they are the sons of Afghanistan. You like it, you don't like it, you call them a terrorist organization or not. But our job is to give these people a voice, I think.
Luna, what do you think of what, from the perspective of a citizen journalist and you know, a journalist who doesn't work with a network?
Yeah.
How would you do that? Would you give a voice for, you know, for right now, if I tell you you have an interview with a politician who is, you know, who you think, let's say, or is involved in the Beirut blast?
Yeah.
Would you go and interview them?
Of course. And I would ask him the toughest questions. I would ask everything. I mean, I am not for...
What is a tough question you would ask? Let's say, actually, you can, if you want to pick up a name, if you have a name of a politician that you want to ask him, a specific question coming from citizen journalism, who this politician be and what would the question be in such case?
I mean, who the politician might be, I might first want to interview... I think I would want to interview the president himself in Lebanon and then just really ask him, why is one armed party taking all of the decisions in the country? Like, if you are a president, if you celebrate the independence, if all of that, and yet you are politically affiliated, which is fine, there are political groups and political parties everywhere. But like, we in Lebanon look at the presidency as, you know, something very important and symbolic. So why is one group controlling the narrative in Lebanon? And then I would go on and I would interview not only one politician, I would actually give voice to all of the politicians that were involved from different political parties and put them on primetime TV. I am not for banning anyone from speaking. I am for asking them the tough questions. And why did I say the president? Because I think that until now, no one really asked him the tough questions. All what people do online, for example, and to give you context about online, is make fun of the age of the president, how he looks, how he walks. This is not the point. The point is to ask him the hard questions and to observe him failing to answer.
Has he been receiving journalists who want to ask him hard questions? So if President Aoun is to know that someone is coming to ask him a question and they send the questions in advance and the questions are not to something that you... Has he done that? This is a question that I'm not familiar with.
What I observed is that there are journalists from his side, from his political side of work, FPM journalists.
And these are the only ones allowed to ask.
They're not the only one allowed. You can go and interview the president. I mean, but is there a door that is right now open for anyone to go and interview him locally? I don't think so. But just one more thing to say is that it is very hard for freelancers as well to establish these objectivity rules when they are working on their own. Institutions tend to encourage that directly and indirectly. When you are a freelancer, it just becomes a bit more challenging for you, especially, for example, a Lebanese freelancer, as Zeina was saying, immersed in the protests, happy to be involved, and then you have to shake yourself out. So, no, I did not protest as a freelancer, but I only raised one banner once when I was protesting for my fellow photojournalists who were hit in front of a police station in Beirut. But it is not my job to protest with people. It is my job to take pictures and to make sure that these pictures last and are spread to the online audience, international media, and all of that.
And maybe it's harder even for a freelance journalist to get an appointment with the president,
Yeah.
right or wrong. I mean
I
they'll
could
ask you for their
try.
credentials, and you know.
I could try, but
it's
very
quite
hard.
difficult.
Yeah.
Zeina, we've talked about like several conflicts, and you have covered very courageously so many areas. Is there like a manual that like available that applies to every single location, or
No.
how is coverage of war different? Do you like just if you can walk us through the process?
It really depends what kind of war. What you is it a full-blown conflict? Is it blurry front lines? Is it an insurgency? Is it just bomb attacks? Is it, it all depends. And you just don't know what to expect. And I think, I'll just give you one example now. In Aleppo, it was controlled by the opposition, the eastern side of the city. Sometimes you are faced with a reality that you just don't know how to deal with. Once we were there, when I started to hear from people in the area, there are bodies, they're picking up bodies from the river. Now I didn't, I thought maybe what are they talking about? 1, 2 bodies, normal, right? I mean, I hate to speak this way, but it's normal in a war zone. But I heard them say dozens. I said, okay, let's go see. And they were pulling 80 bodies from a river. Bodies that were decomposing, their hands tied, gunshot wounds to the head. They took the bodies to a courtyard in a school. And then families came to try to identify the victims. But this is a war crime. And we are there. There's no other international team there. If we film this, we document history. We document a war crime. It's not my job to be a judge. I cannot judge this. I cannot say who's responsible. But I had to think. I had everything in front of me. And you as a journalist one day can serve, international justice. I thought, what is the best thing to do? Explain. The river flows from government territory to rebel territory. That means the bodies came from there to here. Then I started to ask the question to the families. When did you last see your family member? Where were they when they disappeared? Most of them were crossing into government-controlled territory because they worked. At that time, the front line was not blocked. I mean, little things like this. Every war is different. And you tell me Libya, it was different. The front lines kept moving back and forth, and even the fighters were not as professional as in other areas. It all depends. But like I said before, it's very important to do your research, to know what you're getting into, to keep yourself alive.
Thank you, Zeina. Stefania, back to you. And we're going to be now talking about, so you covered the pandemic, and you did cover several war areas and so on. What is a story that sticks in your mind as a journalist where you felt, I might not make it after? And for so many journalists today, under a lot of pressure, under a lot of danger, what goes in the mindset? What goes... how do you communicate with your family? I mean, this panel is about how journalists can equip themselves. So now I'm taking you to the extreme, to when you're actually at that dangerous zone and you feel your life is threatened, whether it's from a virus or a terrorist group just out of the house.
I'm telling that I just came back from Armenia after the Nagorno-Karabakh war. And I discovered a very terrifying situation because the borders now between Armenia and Azerbaijan has changed. So a lot of citizens are without houses, and the Azerbaijani troops trade them every day, and nobody talk about that in this period. After 1 year, the silence of the world is very, very deep. And I discovered a very dangerous situation because there are no international NGO, there are no helps for people, the international troops are they are just Russian peacekeepers. So in Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation is out of control because no journalists, international journalists can enter there, and it's impossible to cover that situation. So we know just that there were a lot of refugees, but we don't see if they have water and electricity and so on. In Armenia, in the Lachin corridor between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation is under control, but every day the Azerbaijani troops go on in the Armenian border. So the situation is very, very dangerous and confused. For that, maybe after COVID emergency, it's the more shocking situation I live in in this period, because every day people discovered death and discovered some zone under the Azerbaijani control with a lot of cemetery in the sky. I don't know. I don't find the word, but a lot of corpse in the sky.
Dangerous indeed. Larissa, we're reaching towards the last bit of this e-panel, and I'm a writer. I love stories. So I want each of the speakers, and I'll start with you, Larissa. One story from journalism. I mean, it can be anything. It can be something from the, from the backstage of journalism. It can be something for young journalists watching today to hear this story and leave with some sort of any kind of feeling, whether that is something to learn, something to look forward to, or something to fear, or something to be careful of. So I'll start with you, Larissa.
Unmute. Okay. There's a lot I could talk about, but I would say, as a journalist, I want to tell the story of how we can change things, help others, even if it's, nothing major, but it can make a difference. We all know the difficult situation in Lebanon during the past 2-3 years. And as a journalist and as someone very active on social media, I managed to really make a difference in the lives of so many. Help, well, it's not part of my job, but I mean, because your voice can reach out, that message will reach out to a larger audience. And several times, I'm not going to talk about specifics and mention anyone in specific, but I wanted to say that really, I felt for once that I could do a difference in people's lives. I could change. I could help. I could be of assistance. Being in a position of a public figure, where my voice could reach many. I really made a difference, and I really was able to help a lot of people who needed that help during these very difficult times in Lebanon.
Zeina, what would your story?
It would be Libya, because that was history, witnessing history. It's something else. Entering the capital, Tripoli, it was falling. It was the end of 4 decades of Gaddafi's rule. An elderly man just comes up to me, broken English, but I can still hear him. For 40 years, we are free. We are free. And the euphoria in the people's faces, that is something you will never forget. And you're documenting, and you're not only witnessing history, you're documenting history. But also, 2 or 3 weeks later, you sit next to a young boy outside Sirte, and who's worried about the future of his country. And he seemed to be a Gaddafi loyalist. And he said to me, you see those guns? Soon they're going to turn it against each other once the common enemy is gone. So there you had 2 stories that we presented to the world. The euphoria, those who were fighting for a new Libya, and those who were afraid of change. And I think when you get those 2 stories across, you did your job first, and second, you witnessed and you documented history. And I think this is just amazing. It's amazing.
I'm going to be ending this e-panel with you, Luna. And today I look at Larissa's work, Stefania and Zeina, and they're great work, especially in the last few years. The world has been a busy place. And I want to be the voice of people watching this panel from an objective, like the utmost objectivity. How much do you think, as a citizen journalist, how much do you feel that journalism has played in moving nations in certain directions, based on something brilliant Larissa said, like at the beginning of the panel, when she said that sometimes there is policy that is relating to your employer.
Yeah.
So how, today, if we are to evaluate our generation's journalism, have we been played in some areas? I hear that on this, on just among people and everything, like, this channel or that channel or this institution or that played us. I hear it might be conspiracy theories in some areas. It might be just the way people feel, like in what Zeina was saying. There is the loyalist and there's the, the revolter. As you, as a young journalist, have we been played, or have we been being fed objective journalism in general?
I mean, everyone gets played every once in a while with a piece of information, with an interview, with an opinion. We get overly excited about something, or we don't give it the needed amount of attention. But in my opinion, as long as we are searching for the truth, like the truth about something, the truth about a story, there's always a way to counter the inaccurate narrative. And I just want to end this with one example. When you were talking about stories that left a mark, in 2012, there were border areas in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon that are known, and they are still there, that are known as the mixed areas. No one knows where it ends, where the exact crossing ends between Lebanon and Syria, or where the borders were. And we were getting news that there was shelling happened and that sheep were dying. Animals were dying by random shells that were falling there. And there were small families who are Syrian, Lebanese, married to each other, who are suffering because there's no income. This land is the only source of income for them. And I wanted to search for the truth. This was when I was just starting in journalism, and this is why I say the truth is important. This is what has been driving me all this time. And so I decided to go there and to sleep there with a fellow journalist. We called it an overnight in Mashari' al-Aa. And she will remember this, because the amount of fear that I felt as I was entering the bathroom and the shelling started. No one in the local media believed that the Syrian regime was shelling that area, up until we tweeted about it. And I had maybe 100 followers on Twitter back then, and they started picking up these videos that are of low quality. I am not a professional in videography, and they started saying, oh wow, the Syrian regime is shelling families in Mashari' al-Aa. And I was this young journalist, and I felt that I went to search for the truth, and I got it. And of course, I got into trouble with my parents because I lied. I didn't tell them I was sleeping right on the border and I was being shelled. But as a journalist, I was satisfied. This story specifically is what keeps pushing me to search for the truth. It is not my truth. It's the truth of what's happening, even if I don't like it. I mean, it's the story,
Thank you, Luna. Larissa, Stefania, Zeina, and Luna, thank you very much for being part of this e-panel. If we want to take a little bit of key insights from four amazing journalists, four amazing heroes, it is for young journalists to always prepare and be ready when going to cover. Thanks to Zeina and Larissa for being such advocates of this today. From Stefania, I and everyone who listened learned that you may not be ready to be covering an event. In such a case, you have to work as a team with your fellow colleagues and with the resources available. And with Luna and every speaker today, your safety, watch out for your safety. Follow these measures if you work for an institution, or there are so many resources available for young journalists today to feel and be well equipped in covering pandemics, crises, and unfortunate events that may happen at any time. A big part of this panel was devoted to the Beirut blast, who we have Zeina, Larissa, and Luna, who were also victims of such an event. I think humanity in general was a victim. So I end this e-panel hoping that an investigation reaches a place, and all the hard work of every journalist, whether it's a mother who left her child to report and give us the news, or it's a journalist who is covering with so much bravery, that this material will reach the right, the right desk of a judge, or the right ears, the right eyes, and justice will be served for the victims of the Beirut blast. Thank you for the Chidiac Foundation for hosting this panel. I think a lot of journalists owe MCF a big thank you for all these resources. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.